Annie Halford visits her mother Emma's grave and remembers when her mother told her about fairies who were enslaved by humans. As a sugar master, Annie believes in treating fairies as equals. When she returns to her village, Annie decides to go to the Royal Candy Fair in Lewiston, despite her friend Jonas Anders' objections due to the dangerous journey. While passing through the town of Reddington, Annie witnesses a fairy about to be killed by a fairy hunter who is crushing its detached wing. She rescues the fairy and helps it escape by returning its wing. Since Annie needs a fairy slave to be her bodyguard on the way to Lewiston, she buys a warrior fairy named Chow Fen Chow. Afterward, they leave Reddington and travel toward Lewiston on a road known as the Bloody Highway. On their first night, Annie and Chow camp at a fort shelter, where Annie informs Chow that she plans to set him free once they reach Lewiston. The next day, they are attacked by bandits, who are also attacking another wagon, but Chow defeats them. Annie meets up with Jonas again after Chow saved him from the bandits, and despite Annie's objection, he accompanies her to Lewiston. At night, Annie meets Kathy, a fairy serving Jonas, and makes a meal for everybody. With Chow absorbing the food rather than eating it like a human does, she is informed fairies can only taste silver sugar. Annie noticed somebody snuck into her wagon, and she goes in and finds the fairy she saved in Reddington, Mithril Lid Pod, hiding in it. Mithril insists on returning the favor, but Annie is disinterested. Annie and Jonas continue their journey, and on the next night, Annie formally introduces Chow to Jonas. The next day, Annie and Jonas are attacked by a pack of hungry crows and Chow defeats them. However, the attack delayed their travels, and being unable to make it to the next fort shelter before nightfall, they stay at a nearby doctor's inn instead. At the doctor's inn, fellow guest and sugar artisan Hugh tasks Annie and Jonas with making confections in exchange for him paying for their stay. Despite producing good confections, Hugh criticizes Jonas for lacking ingenuity and Annie for lacking creativity. He smashes their confections but agrees to pay for their stay. At night, Chow recalls the time when he befriended a human girl named Elizabeth 15 years ago, but she was killed by humans, leading him to mistrust humans. The next day, Annie prepares to make her entry confection, but discovers her supply of silver sugar has mysteriously vanished. With help from Jonas, she finds some sugar apples just in time to replenish her supply of silver sugar and make her entry piece. However, Jonas betrays Annie by having Kathy splatter Annie with blood from raw meat to attract a pack of wolves, forces Chow to protect her, using distraction to steal Annie's wagon with her confection in it and make his getaway. A despair-ridden Annie goes into Jonas' wagon to find her missing supply of silver sugar and learns from the blueprints he intended to enter a piece designed by her mother, and being unable to make it, he resorted to stealing Annie's confection. Annie decides to return Chow's wing and set him free, but Chow refuses to leave and wanting Annie to keep her promise of making him a confection. The next morning, Annie meets a fairy named Luzil El Min and makes another confection modeled off Luzil. Annie and Chow travel through the night and arrive in Lewiston right before the confections are judged. Annie learns the person she met at the doctor's inn is the silver sugar Viscount Hugh Mercury. Annie and Jonas are ordered to present their confections to the king, and the king declares Jonas the winner. However, when Mithril appears, Annie explains the truth: she made the confection and Jonas submitted it as his own. Hugh orders Annie and Jonas to make the confection Jonas submitted to prove Annie's accusation. Jonas struggles, and despite her best effort, Annie is unable to reproduce her confection. As such, neither Annie nor Jonas could take credit for making the winning confection, and the royal medal was not awarded to anybody. Afterwards, Annie punishes Jonas by slapping him in the face. Despite having completed his task, Chow decides to stay with Annie, wanting a confection from a silver sugar master, while Annie is determined to try again. Annie goes around the different shops owned by silver sugar masters in Lewiston and ends up working at a shop owned by the silver sugar master Cat after being accused of destroying a confection after a thief tried to steal it. Despite not being at fault, Annie decides to help Cat make a replacement, seeing this as an opportunity to watch a silver sugar master in action. At the end of the day, Cat runs out of silver sugar, but Annie works through the night to replenish it so Cat can immediately get to work. Later in the day, the Viscountess Clay visits the shop offering to buy the confection he's making for a cobbler's daughter at an exorbitant price, but Cat maintains his policy of not making confections for people he dislikes like Clay. As Clay leaves, Annie notices the thief is her servant. At night, the thief returns to steal the confection, but is caught as Annie had delivered the confection earlier and replaced it with a fake. The next day, Annie learns Cat's real name is Alf Hamley, a silver sugar master she greatly admires, as she and Chow set out for Westall, a place known for its cold weather. Hugh presents the Earl of Downing with a confection and talks about Annie, who has returned to Lewiston in preparation for Pole's Soul Day after struggling to get customers in Westall. To build her reputation and earn some money, Annie heads to Philax, a seaside town run by the Duke of Philax, William Alburn. after being told William will pay a huge reward to the artisan who makes him the best confection, regardless of whether or not the artisan is a silver sugar master. At the castle, Annie presents William with a confection modeled off mithril and passes the first test. Afterwards, she is tasked with making the confection modeled off a fairy lady in a painting. As she heads off to the workshop, she runs into Jonas and 2 other students from the Radcliffe workshop, who accuse her of setting Jonas up at the festival. Annie spends the next few days working on the confection, and just before completing it, she encounters Jonas again. Jonas already finished his confection and was chosen to be William's artisan. The next day, Annie presents her confection to William. Liking hers better than Jonas, William decides to have both Annie and Jonas stay at the castle to make him a confection. As Mithril informs Annie Jonas is having a mental breakdown, Annie produces a new version of the confection. However, William is not satisfied and vaguely instructs her to give it form. Annie produces a new confection, having made several changes to it, but William deems it much worse than the last one and breaks it in anger. At night, Chal talks about Elizabeth in order to make her feel better. Annie returns to her room, but he sees Jonas has taken hold of Mithril's detached wing. With Jonas threatening to break Mithril's wing to kill him, Annie sends Chal out of the castle by his order, while instructing her to not oppose anything Jonas says when meeting William. In the meeting with William, Annie notices William has been abusing Jonas. Annie makes a deal with William, promising to stay until she makes the confection while allowing Jonas to leave. Meanwhile, outside the castle, Chal runs into Hugh, who informs him William has not been to Lewiston lately, and viewing this as unfealty to the royal family. The Earl of Downing has sent soldiers to subjugate William and would likely lead to his death. Hugh arrives to convince William to go to Lewiston, but refuses. As the sun rises with Annie looking at the painting again, she notices she overlooked a critical detail of the fairy has both of her wings, thus, she is not a slave. Having discovered the fairy in the painting, Leela Sil Errol, or Christina as William named her, is not a slave, and he asks William questions about her. William reveals Christina was a water fairy he was in love with, and she died recently. Meanwhile, as Hugh explains to Chal, Christina's death caused William to neglect his duties as a duke, and they run into the Earl of Downing. Hugh begs the Earl to call off the subjugation while Annie is still in the castle, but he refuses. Having snuck out of the castle, Mithril informs Chal Jonas force Annie to dismiss him from the castle, and she wants him to return. Back in the castle, Annie decides to make her confection in front of William to get feedback as it is being made. Chal arrives to take Annie out of the castle, but Annie refuses to leave until finished. As the confection nears completion, William explains he hopes to bring Christina back by gazing at a confection of her, but Chal debunks this myth. Hugh and the soldiers arrive at the castle, but at Chal's request, they wait until Annie is finished. After putting the silver eyes in, Annie completes the confection and William has the confection he wanted. Afterwards, Annie is paid her reward and exits the castle, permitting the soldiers to go in and take William into custody. Back in Lewiston, Annie is told thanks to her confection. William has changed for the better and receive a lenient punishment as a result. The Pole Soul Day festival begins as Annie prays for her deceased mother with a confection. 9 months later, Annie returns to Lewiston to prepare for the Royal Candy Fair and runs into Kat along the way. Kat informs Annie this year's unusually low crop yield of sugar apples and harvesting by individuals is banned. In order to participate, Annie will need to make her own supply of silver sugar by temporarily residing at the Radcliffe workshop, and having not been informed of the edict on purpose due to her reputation, she heads to the workshop. At the workshop, she meets up with Jonas and fellow artisan Sammy Jones, and Sammy bullies Annie until Keith Powell arrives to intervene. Needing to find a place for Chal to stay since he is not a labor fairy, Keith decides to make a confection modeled off Chal to allow him to stay. The next day, after spending a night at the dormitory, Keith explains he helped Annie get in because his situation is similar to hers, as he is the son of the previous Silver Sugar Viscount Edward Powell. While Edward came from the page school, Keith chose to join the Radcliffe School instead in order to be treated like a regular artisan. Keith did not enter the exhibit while Edward was alive because winning would draw criticism for receiving special treatment, while losing would label him a big disappointment for failing to live up to his family's expectations. Afterwards, Keith privately tells Chal he wants to compete against a worthy opponent, which he sees in Annie and not in Sammy or Jonas, and this is likely Annie's last chance to win as due to her reputation. Her competitors will likely do everything to stop Annie from acquiring sugar apples. Being the only woman in the workshop, Kat explains there are not many women artisans because of the physically demanding work involved in refining silver sugar. The workshop's headmaster and Jonas' uncle Marcus Radcliffe drops by ordering Kat and Elliot Collins, the acting headmaster of the Page workshop, to oversee the refinement. Annie gets to work and struggles before encountering Elliot and Bridget Page, the daughter of the Page workshop headmaster Glenn Page and Elliot's fiancé. After working all day refining silver sugar, Annie gets food from Bridget, who expresses her skepticism about female artisans and secures her supply of sugar apples for the exhibition. At night, after Annie falls asleep, Chow goes out and runs into Bridget, and Bridget expresses her love for Chow, but Chow rejects her feelings. 6 days later, Annie argues with Sammy over how to refine the sugar apples, with Sammy disregarding quality before Keith takes Annie outside the workshop. Keith shows Annie his entry confection modeled off Chow as Annie figures out what her entry piece will be. As Annie looks out the window, she sees Bridget falling for Chow. Bridget explains to her the marriage with Elliot was arranged and she doesn't love him, and Chow made her heart race. Chow responds, telling Bridget she must possess his wing and order him to fall in love with her. At night, Jonas tells Annie he's making something he wants, which has Annie lost in thought, figuring out her entry confection. The next day, Annie and Chow visit the cathedral, and Annie takes note of the painting of the battle between the founding King Cedric and the Fairy King Raselva Sash. Chow explains Cedric was once the Fairy King's slave, but they became friends and desired harmony between humans and fairies. However, the humans and fairies hated each other and went to war with Cedric, killing the Fairy King. Cedric created a confection of the Fairy King to remember him, hoping Cedric's vision of the world happens, which is why the royal family favors fairies for confections. Annie stares at Chow's wing, giving her the inspiration needed to make her entry confection. Afterwards, Annie works on her confection and produces one with roses wrapped around Chow's wing. At night, Sammy orders Jonas to bring Annie into the workroom to see Radcliffe. However, it is actually a trap, where he and his guys hold them both hostage. Sammy tries to burn Annie's hands in a pot of boiling water, but Jonas escapes and alerts Chow, who manages to stop Sammy in time and forces Sammy and his guys to flee. Radcliffe drops by to apologize and has Jonas kicked out, but refuses to discipline Sammy due to his longtime apprentice reporting the incident, leading to a heated argument, where Mithril accuses Sammy of using Jonas to lure Annie out, and he lied to cover his involvement. Radcliffe refuses to listen and threatens to shut him up, but Chow calls him out, being a rotten teacher for not disciplining Sammy. Insulted, Radcliffe then orders Annie to leave the workshop and never come back. Annie leaves the workshop. After she falls asleep, Mithril informs Chow Annie's supply of silver sugar was switched out with a mass-produced stuff made at the Radcliffe workshop. In the aftermath of Sammy's assault, Jonas flees in terror. Chow returns to the workshop and looking for evidence to prove Annie's silver sugar was swapped. He approaches Bridget, who saw everything. However, she refuses to cooperate, even when Chow threatens to kill her. At the Royal Candy Fair the next day, Hugh is informed about the mass-produced silver sugar and has Radcliffe inspect the barrels in Annie's wagon to confirm the suspicion. Meanwhile, Chow makes a deal with Bridget by giving her his wing in exchange for her testimony. Annie responds to the allegation, saying her confection was made with her own silver sugar. Annie reveals her confection by orders of the king and breaks off a piece of her confection, offering it up to the royal family's fairy servant Clifford, who confirms Annie's confection was not made with mass-produced silver sugar. Bridget arrives to tell the king Sammy switched out the barrels, which Clifford confirms. Radcliffe is angered at Sammy for his actions, and he removes him as his apprentice and disqualifies him. With Annie acquitted, the Royal Candy Fair continues, and she is awarded the Royal Medal. Afterwards, Chow bids farewell to Annie as he is now Bridget's servant, and Elliot tells Annie Chow exchanged his freedom for her dream. Annie is left in shock and despair upon hearing this and cries for Chow to come back.